Shalom, everyone. It is great to have you here, and it's great to have my special guest, Professor Gary Rendsburg, who's the Blanche and Irving Laurie Professor of Jewish History at Rutgers University. Gary is also a member of our shul, the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet, and it's great to see you, even on Zoom. We don't get to see you in person, but we want to talk about Egypt, Egyptology, Passover, and there's just so much to think about. So let's go right into that.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're not even going to talk about, did the Exodus really happen? Okay, I'm going to leave that question that's a different kind of question. But to what extent can you identify Egypt in the story? If you're taking Exodus 1 to 15, and you've done a lot of research on this and a lot of writing on this, where do you find Egypt? And how does Egypt showing up in different stories? And maybe you can give us a couple of examples of this.
It actually shows up everywhere, in every chapter, every verse. It just permeates the entire story, the entire narrative. Where does one begin? Let's start with the birth of Moses and his mother placing him in a basket and hiding the basket in on the banks of the Nile River. We actually have a story about Horus, the Egyptian god, when his mother Isis does the same thing. He's a baby, to protect him from the machinations of his evil uncle, the god Seth. Isis places baby Horus in a basket, puts him in the banks of the Nile, hides him there secretly, nurses him. All of the elements that you see in the story in Exodus chapter 2. And again, notice, although Moses' father is mentioned in passing in the first verse, everything else is in the hands of his mother, and then eventually, of course, in the hands of his sister. And the fact that the mother is brought to nurse the baby is all a reflection of this Egyptian story. And it's a subversion of the Egyptian story, and not just a reflection, but a subversion of it. And that's because Pharaoh Horus is actually the god of kingship, and Pharaoh is seen as the living embodiment of the god Horus. So in the biblical story, Moses is the hero. And in fact, he now needs protection from the wicked Pharaoh, who has, of course, decreed that all babies should be cast into the Nile. And Pharaoh is turned into the wicked Uncle Seth. So there's a whole subversion here of this foundational myth of ancient Egypt. That's just like the beginning of the story.
The beginning. I mean, so this theme of subversion, I mean, occurs in so many different places. And I'm sure you'll be able to give us some other examples of this. We have one of the highlights of the Passover story really is we get to this place in the Haggadah with the plagues, and you've written on the subject that at least 3 of these plagues are really taking this idea to the max here. The plague of locusts, darkness, and the firstborn. So I want you to explain to people watching, listening, how is it that the plague of locusts, how does it work? How does the plague of darkness work? How does the plague of the firstborn really subvert some of these stories from Egypt?
So these are the last 3 plagues. We should point out that the first couple of plagues, the Nile turning into blood and the frogs and the lice, and etc., they're plagues, but they're nuisances to society, right? I mean, they're just nuisances to have. And of course, this is okay. So there you have it. When you get to the later plagues, that is to say, there's a buildup and a climax. The last 3 plagues are all directed against the sun. So the god Ra, sometimes pronounced Ra, sometimes pronounced Re, is the Egyptian sun god. And because the sun shines ever present in Egypt, there's never a cloudy day, the god Ra becomes essentially de facto the head of the pantheon. And these plagues all blot out the sun. So a locust swarm can actually blot out the sun, which in fact the text states. Darkness for 3 days. How do we naturally understand that? Probably a sandstorm of sorts, right? In fact, the text says that the darkness could be felt, so that might suggest a sandstorm. And then the 10th plague occurs at midnight, pure darkness and or metaphorical darkness in the homes of the Egyptians with the death of the firstborn. So these are no longer just nuisances, right? These are an attack on the central prominent deity of the Egyptian pantheon, the god Ra. And the text actually says that the locust swarm covered the eye of the earth, Ein Haaretz. That actually is an idiom in Egyptian. It's translating an Egyptian idiom, which is one of the epithets of the god Ra, or the sun itself, right? So these texts are very familiar with Egyptian culture, Egyptian religion, and more. And the one other item here, which is just so wonderful, is that the 8th, 9th, and 10th plagues are introduced by Pharaoh saying to Moses, Ki ra'ah neged penechem, because you have evil before you. You're up to no good. You have an evil intent. But of course, that Hebrew word ra'ah, evil, is playing off of the Egyptian name of the sun god, also spelt Resh Ayin or Resh Ayin Hey. So that is the springboard then for the next 3 plagues, which are directed at Ra. There's so much happening in these chapters.
Do you think that the early Israelite audience for this story is aware, how versed are they in Egyptian motifs, in Egyptian literary tropes, and why would they be?
So they have to be. Well, let's say this. The text itself indicates such an awareness, and one has to assume that at least a significant portion, perhaps the most educated portion or whatever, of the ancient Israelite population would have understood these motifs. You go watch a Shakespeare play, or you view this film, you may not catch everything the first go round, but you might catch it the second go round. The educated portion of the audience, which has a greater cultural background, might catch more than you do. But clearly, with so much Egyptian material reflected in the Exodus chapters 1 through 15, I have no doubt that the ancient Israelite audience would have understood this. Let's remember that Egypt was the great power of the ancient world. Israel was a small, insignificant little country on the margins, trying to get itself started, as the Bible describes, during this time period. And larger countries always shed their influence over the smaller countries on the margins. I mean, this is just the way it is, right? I mean, America is a superpower, and we send through our media, television, movies, music, whatever it is, the whole world knows our, Star Wars, but, we may not know anything about smaller countries' culture, pick it, Bolivia or Cambodia or some small culture, but they'll know Star Wars, or Canada even, right?
Well, look, it's a great example, although, there's a contiguous border of, I don't know how many thousand miles, but the influence comes over, and that is a good way to understand the proximity of Egypt to Israel. And I mean, you're talking about trade routes, you're talking about people, you're talking about all sorts of kinds of things that are going on, and evidence in the text itself of these things. So you're saying then that the average Israelite, let's put him in the first temple period, in the golden age of Solomon's temple, where a lot of this literature is just flourishing, and they're having a good chuckle.
I think they're having a good chuckle. Absolutely. There was never a time when Israel and Egypt were not in contact with one another. I mean, the Israelites are in Egypt, and that's a whole other topic, but yes, there's sufficient evidence to demonstrate that. It's not always direct evidence, it's often indirect evidence, but nevertheless, I think the point can be demonstrated. And we also should point out, by the way, that Egypt ruled the land of Canaan during the 15th, 14th, 13th, into the 12th centuries when the Egyptian army retreated. They had garrisons in Beit Sha'an and Megiddo and Lachish and Gaza. People in the land would have known Egyptian culture that way, plus the trade routes and going to Egypt in times of famine. And They just knew each other. U.S. and Canada is a good example. I mean, the population U.S. is much larger. Landmass Canada is the same or even larger, but it's that kind of relationship.
All right, so let me ask you a specific example of this cultural appropriation, or not a cultural appropriation, but an example of a motif that is found in the text and means something very specific in Egyptian culture. And I'm referring to the heaviness of Pharaoh's heart. This is something that I have to say, every year we read through the Parshiot of Shemot, the first weeks of Parshat of the book of Shemot, I get this question, why is God always hardening Pharaoh's heart? Why is Pharaoh's heart so heavy? And what does this mean? So take us into that world and explain what you have here on the screen.
Well, we're going to do a little screen sharing here. The wonder of Egypt is its art. I mean, it's literature too, but its art is just so remarkable. And of course, go into any major museum. We have two in our area, the Metropolitan Museum, the larger one, but also the Brooklyn Museum. They have great Egyptian collections. This happens to be from the British Museum, although there are similar texts from it at the Met and the Brooklyn Museum as well. The Book of the Dead was the most important religious text of ancient Egypt, right? It's a little bit like their Torah, Lahavdil, right? And this is the foundational text of their society. And that's because in their mind, there was so much to do concerning the dead and the afterlife, right? The Egyptians are the only people in the ancient world who believed in a physical continuation of this life into the afterlife with your body and soul and everything together. And so if you could afford it, you spent your life preparing for your death with a beautiful tomb. And the largest of all the tombs, of course, are the ones of the pharaohs, especially the pyramids from the Old Kingdom. These are New Kingdom texts. These are the very time that the people of Israel are arising in the historical record, emerging in the historical record, 14th, 13th, 12th centuries BCE. So here you have a vignette on the Book of the Dead, and these are a series of rituals, and they're described for you in the hieroglyphics, and then the artwork shows you how you get from this world to the next world. So on the left, we'll zoom in a second. On the left is the deceased. In this case, his name is Hunefer, dressed in fine white linen, and he is being led in to the scene by the god Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, and you see he's carrying the Ankh symbol of life. And we'll come to this scene in just a moment. And then he's escorted after that scene, and he's placed before Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and his wife Isis and her sister Nephthys. Just this beautiful artwork. But directly to the question is the scene that I skipped over because I wanted to show it to you up close. And here is Anubis escorting Hunefer before Thoth, the ibis-headed god on the right, who's the god of writing. And Anubis is weighing the heart, see the scales, he's weighing the heart of the deceased against the feather of truth. And in every Book of the Dead, we have dozens of these Book of the Dead manuscripts. In every one, they balance out. Because if your heart is light, that means you've led a truthful life. Right? It balances against the feather of truth. There's nothing lighter than the feather of truth. But if your heart is heavy, of course, we don't have any examples of this since everybody always passes it to the next world. If your heart is heavy, it falls to the ground. And this creature, the devourer, who is a combination body of a hippo, lion's mane, and crocodile head, will devour the heart that's on the ground. If Pharaoh's heart is heavy, right, it tips the scales, it goes to the ground, the devourer eats the heart, and the deceased Pharaoh does not make it into the next world, and all of Egypt descends into chaos, right? That is the root of Egyptian religion. And so when the Bible repeats over and over again, we have different verbs. Sometimes it's God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh's heart was hard. These are the 6 references which use the Hebrew word kaved, that Pharaoh's heart is heavy. So behind all of these texts is this incredible scene, we'll get to that in a moment, this incredible scene of the weighing of the heart, which is literally at the heart of the Book of the Dead and what it means to go into the next world. These biblical stories are just remarkable. They're just like evoking Egypt at every turn.
So it's almost as if, you're an ancient Israelite. You're roasting your korban pesach at the temple, and you flip open your scroll of Exodus, and you're reading through some of these stories, and you get it. You understand that when God says Pharaoh's heart is heavy, or I'm going to harden his heart, it's almost as if he's saying he's evil, and I'm sorry, he's evil, and that he will make it. He's not the thing that he wants most is to live in eternity. It's not going to happen, right? And that this story really is a reinforcement of his evil. Just go back to 1 second, which is the preponderance of death in Egyptian culture. And I want you to just, the sentence when the Israelites are finally out of Egypt and they say, how do you read that? Was it a lack for graves in Egypt that you took us out to die in the desert? Is that
one more recognition of how the people of Israel knew Egypt? We should point out, by the way, that in ancient Israel and elsewhere in the ancient world, but certainly we know this best from ancient Israel because of the intense archaeological work that's been done, tombs are not visible. People were buried in caves, sometimes natural caves, sometimes they're carved out a little bit more. They become family tombs. There are niches to lay the dead on. There are no cemeteries of the sort that we're used to, right? We don't get that kind of a cemetery until actually the 1st century BCE. And even then, it's not common. Throughout all of ancient times in Israel, the deceased were typically buried in these caves, inaccessible, natural ones carved out, or maybe man-made ones cut into the hillsides. You can walk the length and breadth of Israel in antiquity and not really see tombs. In Egypt, you can't miss them. I mean, the pyramids, of course, are the largest of them, and by the time the Israelites got there, they would have been 2,000 years old. But all the other tombs are just to be found everywhere. So that line in Exodus, was it for a lack of graves in Egypt that you took us out to die in the desert? This is the Israelites complaining to Moses, because the beginning of all the complaints, right? The Egyptians are pursuing them from behind. They've got the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, in front of them. They look like they're trapped. This works. And a colleague of mine said he'd never quite understood that verse until he finally went to Egypt and said, wow, I mean, they're just everywhere.
Is there truth to the idea that why Judaism, biblical Israel, and Judaism as it's developed by the rabbis becomes so focused on life, and the priesthood of Israel is so focused on life and so removed from death? Could it be because of the proximity to Egyptian culture and the emphasis on death in Egyptian culture?
And there's no way of proving that for sure, but I can tell you, and I don't think you and I have ever talked about this, but my teacher, the great Cyrus Gordon, one of the leading biblical scholars of the 20th century, actually believed that. I don't know if he ever published it, but he certainly taught that in the classroom, that there was this absolute reaction to 180-degree turn away from the Egyptian. I'm going to use the word obsession. I don't mean that. I'm not giving any valence to that. It's not a value-laden term there. It's an objective reflection of what went on in Egypt. That the Israelites just react totally against it, right? And we are life-centered. Death is part of humanity, but the burial customs are simplistic and quick and over and done, right? And you memorialize the dead in the Jewish way, of course, but all those kinds of things that Jews do in the land of Israel, they don't even use coffins, right? In Israel today, in Eretz Yisrael, they just place the body into the ground, right? I mean, and none of that, all of that, I think, is definitely a reaction against the Egyptian, for lack of a better word, obsession with the deceased.
So you had another slide there you were going to talk about. Do you want to just bring it up?
Yeah, let's share that one. Just because the verse appears in the Haggadah, it's just a great it's a great little thing to show. I had a glimpse of it before. This is called the pharaonic stance. Now you see this with a number of pharaohs, but no more than with Ramses II, 13th century BCE. This is on the walls of his tomb, of his temple at Abu Simbel. It's a temple devoted to the god Osiris, whom I showed you a few moments ago. It's in the far south of Egypt, in Nubia, near the border with Sudan. And he's smashing the enemies. First of all, he's trampling on one defeated person and holding another one and smashing him as well.
The figure of a person under his foot there, is that it?
This is one person down here, right? Head, body, 2 arms, 2 legs, who's been trampled by the Pharaoh, and here's the other one being smitten, right, by the Pharaoh. Okay, ready to smite him. And what is this stance, right? This is what the Bible says, right? God brought the people out of Egypt, and now we quote it in Hebrew because it's actually used in the Haggadah, biyad chazaka uzra netuya, right? With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Right? Where did the biblical text get this idea from? And there you see it, right? This is the Pharaoh. God takes over, right? The Egyptians are defeated in the same way that the Pharaoh defeats his enemies. Okay, that's the comeuppance, or that's the, in the rabbinic terminology, perhaps midah keneged midah, right? The measure for measure. Sure. Not just any old defeat, but the defeat through using the Pharaoh, what we call the pharaonic stance. Yeah. Isn't Egyptian art remarkable?
So the strong, his left is the extended arm, the Zroa Netuya, and the right would be the strong arm, the Yad?
Right. The Yad Chazakah would be I guess the one that's holding the weapon there, and the outstretched arm, right, is his left arm, right.
What does the victims or the enemy's curled arm, what do you think that means?
Oh, just defeat, I guess.
He's not going to make it. It's not even a martial arts move.
No. The Pharaohs won every battle, of course, so okay. I have to say, this is, you could probably see the rounded edges. This is my old slide that I took 20 plus years ago when I visited Abu Simbel. And I've looked for crisper, clearer images on the internet and can't find one. So I keep using mine, digitized, slightly fading, but it brings back pleasant memories of my own trip there.
Who is our Pharaoh? Which we got a few pharaohs in Exodus, in Genesis and Exodus. We have Joseph's Pharaoh, and we have the Pharaoh that the first Pharaoh, and then there's a death of a Pharaoh after Moses. So name us some pharaohs.
So I call them the 3 pharaohs, right? There's the Pharaoh of Joseph, end of Genesis. There's the Pharaoh of the slavery, Exodus 1 and 2. And then he dies at the end of Exodus 2. So there's now a new Pharaoh who we'll call the Pharaoh of the plagues and the Exodus, right? So who are they? And we should state the obvious. The problem is that the biblical text just calls them Paro, Pharaoh, or Melech Mitzrayim, king of Egypt. And we don't get any names. We don't get the names of pharaohs until the reign of King Solomon in the book of Kings, and then onward throughout the rest of the Bible, we get the names of pharaohs. We know the name of every single Egyptian pharaoh because the Egyptians themselves kept what are called king lists, and every king and how many years he reigned. In some cases, female pharaohs, she reigned. So if we only had a reference, we would be able to identify these individuals. We don't. The biblical text is silent on that. The biggest clue is in Exodus chapter 1, where the 2 cities that the Israelite slaves build are Pithom and Ramses. Pithom and Ramses. We know where both of them are. They're in the eastern delta. They've both been excavated. And the latter of them, Ramses, is obviously named for the pharaoh. There were 11 individual kings named Ramses, bridging the 19th and 20th dynasties from around 1300 BCE down to the 1000s BCE. The assumption is that it's Ramses II. Ramses II is the one who built the city of Ramses. So he would be the pharaoh of the slavery. Who would be the prior pharaoh doesn't have to be his father or even his grandfather, under whom Joseph serve, but possibly that would be Seti the first and Ramses the first, going before Ramses the second. And who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Was it his son Merneptah or yet a later Pharaoh? I suspect a later Pharaoh, but at least we're in the ballpark if we say the latter half of the 1200s and the first half of the 1100s in that century, BCE, is when the biblical story unfolds, and that's where all the Egyptian evidence, to which all the Egyptian evidence points.
So what's amazing here is that for many of us, and I would say for myself included, up to a certain point, we read these stories and it's almost cartoonish. There's a way that we convey these stories, in one dimension or two dimensions. But what you have done here through your scholarship and through the research, you've managed to give us the real setting of these stories. And in the moments that we have remaining, I want to just reflect with you on what is really one of the dominant themes of the Haggadah. It comes at the beginning, we're the afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu nevonim, kulanu yodim et Torah, more or less, even though we are all smart, all wise, all knowledgeable of Torah, even if we were all Egyptologists,
right.
we have to tell the story. And telling the story in detail, in expansive detail, how praiseworthy is this? So I want to come to the point where your scholarship connects with Judaism, with religious, the religious experience of telling the story, and offer the idea for you to respond to, which is, in what way does this enable us to tell the story? And how much praiseworthy is that?
Well, I obviously think it's very praiseworthy, extremely praiseworthy. It amounts to this. So based on everything we've been talking about, the assumption is that anybody in ancient Israel would have known everything that we've just talked about. They would have had the cultural references. They would have understood the allusions. And I don't want to say that they've ever been into the temple in Abu Simbel to Osiris, or they'd ever seen a Book of the Dead papyrus, right? These things are hidden away in tombs and temples of ancient Egypt. But they knew enough about the culture, and the odds of any of them being able to read hieroglyphics was not great. The ancient Egyptians could barely read it. There was just a scribal elite who could. But they would have known all this, right? Just the cultural references, the cultural markers. And then the whole world lost track of ancient Egypt because the society died out. Egypt became a Christian country and then a Muslim country. The knowledge of hieroglyphics died out. The largest archaeological remains, like the pyramids and these temples, were always standing there, but they just stood there for thousands of years. We live in a world today, because of 200 years of Egyptology now, that we have reclaimed this entire society. And that is the praiseworthiness of it, right? We now can in a way that for 2,000 years, Jews sort of lost track of how much Egyptian material was in this text. And we now are able to recreate what an ancient Israelite would have understood when he or she read or listened to these stories in the Bible concerning Israel and Egypt. Maimonides says in the 12th century, he says, if we knew more about the ancients, meaning not the Jews, but the others, we would understand so much more of the Bible. He intuited that through his rational, logical, Maimonidean, Aristotelian mind. And we now have reached that point where we can actually use all this material and bring it all to life. This is not this is an old new text, right? This is an old text, but it's a new text still for us. It's constantly being reimagined, reinterpreted, reread, reanalyzed in the most positive ways, because we have such a wealth of information. I have no doubt that we'll learn more from the next discovery being made, whether it's an archaeological site in Israel or something found in Egypt. or in the Sinai, we will just continue to unfold the story, and with new layers and so on, of which we've been able to do here today.
What's so amazing is that what you've brought is the uncovering of antiquity, and it is becoming new and refreshed to us, and it's not in collision with the traditional Haggadah, but it's now in conversation with the traditional Haggadah. So the example is, we showed the Biyad Chazakah was Rona Tuyah, the mighty hand, the outstretched arm. So in the Haggadah, it's Biyad Chazakah, Shtayim. 2 plagues represented by Biyad Chazakah, Uvizrona Tuyah, Shtayim, Uvotodu Moftim, Shtayim. The Haggadah goes into the rabbinic midrash about developing the 10 plagues from that line. And now you have Egyptology in conversation with the rabbinic interpretation, and all of a sudden we have new music. It's like bringing in Sephardic cooking with Ashkenazi, and it's like the fusion. We're creating a fusion of the narrative through the study of antiquity, through rabbinic Judaism, and I think through all the other disciplines that we're able to bring to bear to telling the story. I think that's what's going on.
You use that word fusion, which is great. And if we have a minute, I should add, because it goes back to something we talked about. I mean, remarkably, that word ra'ah, which appears right before the 8th plague, which we referred to earlier, meaning evil. The Midrash, of all places, it's in Shir HaShirim Rabbah. It's in an odd place to find it, but there it is. It's in one of these Midrashic texts. The rabbis actually say that Ra'ah is the name of a star. Now, how did they know that? It turns out that, of course, it's the Egyptian word for sun. And when the rabbis say that it's the name of a star, they mean, of course, it's some sort of polytheistic deity or something like that is what their intent is. I mean, they're living in a Greco-Roman world, but that pantheon isn't all that different from an ancient Near Eastern or ancient Egyptian one. They knew that. Right? There's the fusion. And now we know, of course, that it is the Egyptian word for God, for the sun god. Right? That's remarkable. Yeah.
Wow. We've just scratched the surface here. I think that there's certainly a Haggadah worth of material to have and to share. And one of the questions I got is, what are you going to do at your seder? What kind of stories are you going to bring at the seder? But I think that what we've explored here is something that everyone could at least take 2 minutes to share at their seder. And Gary, I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. It was great, Rabbi. It was great to be together, and Chag Sameach to everyone.
And thanks everyone for watching, for listening. And we'll look forward to bringing you more special presentations from special people. So Chag Sameach, and see you soon. Chag Sameach.
Bye-bye.